All right, so there we go. So again, welcome everybody. We're so glad that you're here today to help us share document, a resource that we have been working on for over a year now. So thank you all for your reinforcement. We had 170 people register, so we think people are really excited about this. And again, you know, when you've worked hard on something, it helps to get that kind of reinforcement about the work that you've been doing. So welcome. We do appreciate that you are here on a Friday afternoon and that you've taken the time to do it. We also understand coverage is a huge issue. So again, greatly appreciate you being here. My name is Anne Marie Davidson. I'm an early childhood specialist at EastCon. I am part of the team that supported the development of the Connecticut Guide to Intervention Models for Children with Autism Spectrum Disorders in Inclusive School Settings. I had to look at my notes off to the side to make sure I got that right. It's a long title, but there was a whole team of people that participated in this work. So we're going to take a moment to introduce ourselves, and then we will get started with our content. So Stacy, if you want to say hello.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Stacy Kronk. I am the program administrator of the Preschool Primary Learning Center, which is at Cooperative Educational Services in Trumbull, Connecticut. So I'm coming from CES, that RESC. Nice to be with you all here today.
Thank you so much, Carrie.
Hello, my name is Carrie Hartman, and I'm the coordinator of Behavior Services and Autism Programs here at Area Cooperative Educational Services. So thank you for being here.
Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy LaQuire. I am a behavior coordinator with Learn on the shoreline of Connecticut. So welcome.
Great. And Mary Jo.
Hello, everyone. I'm Mary Jo Terranova, Senior Education Specialist at CAS-CIAC in the Hartford region, Early Childhood Specialist and Special Education Specialist. Glad to be here today and glad you're all joining us.
Wonderful. All right, so let's get started. As I said, we are here to introduce to you the Connecticut Guide to Intervention Models for Children with Autism Spectrum Disorders in Inclusive School Settings. As I also said, we have been working on this resource, on this guide for a little over a year. And a little bit later, you'll hear about our process and sort of how it came to be. But the intention is that it is a resource that is intended to help support and guide reflection and decision-making on your current services, as well as your the models. If everybody could mute, that would be helpful at this point. Certainly, if you have a question, feel free to unmute and pose your question or put your question in the chat. But the resource is really intended to overview some models and to provide an opportunity for you to reflect and move forward in some decision making and thinking about adopting one of those models. In order to do that, we wanted to spend some time today reflecting on sort of why this guidance document was necessary. And that conversation is very closely linked to the least restrictive environment, to our responsibility as special educators, as implementers of IDEA. It is very closely linked to the responsibility that we have in those roles. In order to support making those decisions, we are going to review and revisit what are those characteristics of effective interventions for children on the autism spectrum. Connecticut has a document that was issued in the early 2000s. And so we're going to spend some time looking at that and reflecting on some pieces of the guidelines that help us to identify those effective characteristics. Because as you move into learning about the models that are shared in the new guidance document, you're going to want to make sure that you reflect still on those characteristics. They haven't gone away, they haven't changed. So it's important that we integrate that into our reflection, discussion, decision making and planning. Part of, right, the first part of planning, making a plan to make a change, is the need to reflect on our current practice. So we're going to spend some time giving you a chance to do that in a small group, so you have access to colleagues from across the state to have that discussion. But that will be just the beginning part of that discussion. And it is part of the expectation that after today's session, you'll be able to go back to your district and continue to, again, have this reflection and discussion on your current practice so that you can make a plan for moving forward. And then finally, we're going to get to discussion about the actual guidance document that has been newly developed. So before we get started talking at you for a little bit of time, we wanted to give a chance to gain some feedback from you guys. So I'm going to drop a link to Padlet in the chat, and we'd like you to go there and answer some questions that we have posed for you. So the link is in the chat. If you go ahead and open the chat, click on that link, that will open the Padlet for you, and you will be able to submit your answers to those questions. If you are in a room with a group of people, feel free to have a discussion among yourselves about what you would like to submit to answer those questions. If you click on the plus sign, for people who haven't used Padlet before, if you click on the plus sign, that gives you the box that you can enter your answers into. And I'm going to look to my co-presenters. Was that link a working link? And were you able to access Padlet? Thank you, I see that. So go ahead and enter your responses at this point. Oh, you don't see the plus sign. Well, that's a problem.
Let's see, I don't either on mine.
All right, give me 1 second. Sorry about that. I even rehearsed this morning. Let's try this again. All right, try that link and see if that gives you a plus sign.
Your mom can't go back.
Anne Marie, that doesn't seem to offer one either. Sorry.
Oh, thank you though. That's okay. That's good to know. Oh, that doesn't make any, well, it doesn't make any sense in terms of my Padlet knowledge. Hold on. Okay, we will try.
I'm trying to help you out behind the scenes here, Anne Marie, but I'm not seeing how you make it shareable or if we're able to add it. So it's weird. Copy link to clipboard.
Somebody commented that you have to have an account with Padlet in order to comment.
Oh, really?
So
Oh, so if the person that's opening the Padlet doesn't have an account, such as me, we're not going to see the plus sign.
All right, I just changed. We're going to try one more time, and then we will have to abandon the strategy.
if it doesn't work, we can ask people to comment in the chat and we can read off their responses.
Yep. All right, I changed to permission. Give that one more try. And if that doesn't work, then as Amy or Carrie just said, we will put, you can put that, it works. Yes? We have more than one work.
Yes, I had a plus.
I see 25 people entering the Padlet. Thank you. My apologies about my technology. Okay, now let's do this so that we can see it. Hopefully in real time. There we go. Yay, success.
I have yet to be at an online meeting where all the technology was smooth. There hasn't been one yet.
Got that little step to allow people to actually be able to edit the Padlet.
Good, you can show me so I don't have to make that mistake.
Thank you for your contributions.
A lot of good questions.
Yeah, definitely.
And it looks like we're covering most of this in our content today, which is good.
Yes, wonderful. All right, well, keep the comments coming. As Mary Jo said, what we have planned today will certainly cover some of this. We also have follow-up sessions that will be available to people. So we can also use this information to help guide our follow-up session planning as well. So please continue to add that into there. I saw, again, information about ASD, information about evidence-based practices and strategies, having the ability to bring that back to a team in your district. So all of those things are things that we will touch on today and are part of the longer term plan for the rollout of this guidance document. All right, so we wanted to just make sure that we anchored people around what we will be talking about today. As I mentioned, Connecticut already has a guideline document specific to children with ASD. That's been out for a long time, and that really helps to describe and define what those high quality characteristics of autism interventions are for children in public schools. So we're going to review and revisit some of those components of that, again, of that document. This is the document, the Connecticut Guide to Intervention Models. That is the one, the new one that has been developed. And again, has an introductory section that gives information about autism specifically, and then refers to 6 models of intervention that we're going to share with you today. And then there was a second tool that was developed to be used along the side of the guide to help districts be able to analyze and make decisions and then make a plan for implementation of a model within their district. So we're going to try technology again, and we'll see how this one works. So when you think about autism programming, what words come to mind? You can scan the QR code that is on the screen if you are able to do that, or in a second, I will drop a link to the chat, to the Mentimeter in the chat. And that will also take you to, and hopefully, oh goodness, hopefully that will take you to a working way to enter that information into Mentimeter. Aha, that one is working. And so what do we think about when we are thinking about autism programming for students?
Please listen carefully as our
Right, so we know that in these word cloud kinds of things, the larger words are the ones that are entered more often. And so really when we think about it, we are thinking about social skills, right? And that's pretty apparent and obvious. We understand that that's an area of significant need for students who have been diagnosed with autism. So it makes sense that that is there. Structure, behavior, right? So we think about the need for structured, a structured approach for structure in order for children to be able to function in their environments. We see individualized, we see DTI and ABA in terms of strategies and interventions that are connected to students with autism. Right, routine.
Communication is also a big one.
Yes, communication, right? So we see those major areas of need. But I love some of those smaller words, multidisciplinary, consistency, independence, overwhelming, I see in there also, right? And yeah, when we have students who have significant needs, it can often feel like an overwhelming task, an overwhelming process. Someone entered individualized into the chat, right? So yes, adding to that idea that the importance of individualized services, individualized interventions, individualized decision-making is also really, really critical. Looks like it has slowed down. Thank you very much. So again, when you think about, you know, what you think of in terms of services for kids on the autism spectrum, it is going to affect your decision-making as you review the models. You're going to look for connections between what you know about what are appropriate services, the characteristics that we're going to go over in the next section of our discussion, and then compare those to what you're looking at as you're reviewing information about each of the models. So thank you very much for your input there. So let's get started thinking about and talking about programming and services, right? And so whenever we design or enter into decision-making, again, specific to services and related to program decisions really across the board for any child with an IEP, it's really important that we understand that our decision-making is founded in what we believe. And what we believe is often articulated in principles. These principles come from the guidelines document and they are still in place. So as you are reviewing the models that we are going to share with you today, it's important that, again, you compare what you're learning about in those models to these underlying principles. Is there evidence that in this model that children with autism are viewed as valuable, that they can learn, and that they are worthy of educational interventions, for example? But I wanted to draw your attention specifically to Principle 3, because Principle 3 is about FAPE, and it is about least restrictive environment. And these models are intended to be implemented in environments with typical peers. They're intended to be implemented in environments in inclusive school settings. So implementing these models really supports our implementation of that underlying principle. Okay. These are remaining, the three remaining underlying principles, right? Again, when students are in inclusive settings, they are more likely to have access to the general ed curriculum. So as you're reviewing these models, and if you move toward implementing one of these models, you are also supporting your implementation of Principle 4, right? All of the models have a team implementation component. So again, it's addressing that principle, and adoption of a model certainly probably will mean training, but also the recognition that research is constantly being produced related to autism. It's one of the most highly researched developmental or highly researched disability categories. And so our need to stay on top of that is also being supported as you reflect on your current practices, think about the characteristics we're going to share, and move toward implementing one of the models. So we had lots of planning time when we put this together, and lots of time together to talk and discuss as we were developing the guide. And one of our discussions sort of evolved into this idea, and Andrea shared with us this quote, the idea of backing up to go forward. A lot of our discussion about why this guidance document is necessary started to, or always ended up, I guess, with this connection to LRE. And we wanted to pause here and really emphasize that implementation of IDEA, the process that we engage in specifically around developing an IEP, doesn't go away for children who have autism. That we still need to make sure that we are moving through the entire process of assessment, establishing strengths and concerns, thinking about impact, writing goals and objectives, following up with supports and services, and ultimately determining setting based on all of that information and in an individualized way for all children. We need to make sure that we are preserving that for children who have a diagnosis of autism. And so, you know, again, as we're moving through today and you're reflecting on the content, and then as you start to have those discussions within your district, it's really important that you also stop and pause and be honest about the processes that you use to determine LRE. The guide is there to help you in terms of what tools might we need to be able to implement this, but it's important that we recognize and remember that that is important for children on the autism spectrum, and it doesn't go away just because of their diagnosis. So again, just a reference to the law. The developers of IDEA were really, really smart, and they gave us that roadmap. And it's effective when we use it, and it makes sure that we fulfill our promise to children with disabilities that we are supporting their access to general education, their access and participation in general education, so they have the greatest likelihood to attain that benefit that all other children are gaining when they participate in school environments. And so we need to make sure that we follow this process, that we first talk about access to and participation in general education with supports and services, and then, and only then, do we cycle back to maybe a separate setting, right? I think the other thing that we wanted to remind people of while we have the chance is that it isn't an either or. And if we're making individual decisions, those individual decisions are sometimes general ed with supports and services, and sometimes separate settings, and sometimes a completely separate setting, right? But as long as we are making that decision in that way, then again, we're assuring least restrictive environment. We also, I think sometimes this gets into, you know, we may have a tendency to think about readiness, you know, that we will choose a separate setting while we're getting the child or the student ready to be in general education. And we sometimes apply that thought to students with more significant needs. And so making sure that we are checking ourselves and not applying that lens as we're making decisions about a student's least restrictive environment. Right? I think I may have already covered this, right? And again, that idea that it's not an either or decision. You will receive a copy of the PowerPoint after this, and that link does take you to some guidance about least restrictive environment decision making. So, you know, we collect data in Connecticut, and one of the places we collect data is on an indicator related to where children are spending their time in school. Specifically, indicator 6A is preschool environments, and A is the percent of children aged 3 to 5 with IEPs attending a regular early childhood program and receiving the majority of special education and related services in the early childhood program. For that indicator in 2021, we have about 53% of children with autism spending their time or identified on their through this data collection as spending their time in a regular early childhood program. So I think initially when we look at this, we might think, hey, you know, that's pretty good. We have 53% of children with preschool age children with autism in regular early childhood programs. But I think that part of, as in our reflection and our discussion, what we talked about is, you know, it sort of says, if I am a preschool age child with autism, when I walk through the doors of a public school, I am kind of just as likely to end up in a segregated setting as I am to end up in a general education setting. That's what 50% means. It doesn't really indicate that we have a strong trend in one direction or the other. So I'm just as likely to end up in either of those environments. That may indicate that we're not making decisions on an individualized basis, but rather that we're making decisions based on a diagnosis or based on the type of program that we have, right? And so again, it's a reason for us to pause and really think about why our data look this way. But the last reason that our data may look this way is because we only have one approach. We only have one tool, right? And so what's that saying, that if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So if the only tool we have is a hammer, then we may not, again, be making individualized decisions. And so part of the need for this guidance document that we're sharing with you today is to add tools to your tool belt. These are evidence-based models that are intended to be implemented in inclusive settings. And so back to our word cloud, the two of the largest terms that were entered there in terms of services, in terms of intervention, were DTI and ABA. And we sometimes confuse those and interchange those, but if those are the only tools that we have in our tool belt, then sometimes they get over applied. When we have to answer that question, how do we meet the needs of a child with autism? So the guide that we're sharing with you today is going to add some tools to your tool belt, and it will be able to help you make these more individualized decisions and to answer this question, to sort of move in this direction. It's not a yes general ed setting or no general ed setting, but more when a general ed setting and when needed, when a special setting, right? Okay. I will pause here to say, we're going to go into a breakout room, and I'm going to turn it over to Mary Jo. But before I move on, does anyone have any questions, comments, thoughts that they want to either put in the chat or unmute yourself, and feel free to to share at this point before we move on?
Good wait time, Anne Marie.
All right. So again, feel free though to enter questions at any point in the chat or unmute yourself, raise your hand. But if not, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Jo, who's going to move us into a breakout.
All right. So in the spirit of continuing to reflect on what we're currently doing so that we can move all our programs and our students forward, or a services program, services forward, we're going to have you go into breakout rooms and reflect on these 3 questions. And I will put a document that's, actually, let me do that right now. A document that has all of these questions in it so that you don't have to take a picture of it, and it's right there. So, and hopefully mine will have, I'm pretty sure I know I did editing for all, so it should be fine. So thinking about these 3 questions. What services do you currently offer to your children with autism spectrum disorders? And think the whole gamut. Communication, social skills, extra services, whatever it is. Do these current services meet the requirements of FAPE? Are there concerns that you have about the issues of LRE or determinations made primarily based on diagnosis as opposed to an individual diagnosis? And are you using database decision rules to determine when and where instruction is taking place? So first of all, you need to really have a good idea of what those services are. Was everybody able to access that document before we actually send you off into the groups? Okay, Anne-Marie, you gonna set up the groups? Do we already set them up, or do you want me to? Okay, all right, so, all right. You should have gotten a prompt to join a group. And we'll be calling you back in about 10 minutes. One thing I did not write down. Everybody's back? That gave you enough time to have some really good discussions. The first room that I popped into, the hot topic was struggling to reach your ratios. So is there, not that we have a lot of time, but I would definitely love to hear from some of the groups on what some of the concerns you may have about the issues of LRE and determinations that are made based primarily on the diagnosis as opposed to what they really need. Just unmute yourself if you would like to share. There were 20 groups or 19 groups. I can't imagine all 20 are going to pop out at once, but, or I'm going to randomly throw out a number and ask for volunteer or not.
I'm happy to talk a little bit. I think, Mary Jo, you were in our group for a little bit.
Yes,
in
thanks,
Greenwich, in the Greenwich Public Schools. And you know, as far as our decisions for kids who are on the autism spectrum or suspected to be on the autism spectrum, because sometimes we're not even making those classifications at the early ages, we make the decisions for them just as we do for all kids with special education needs who are identified. So we have a program that's, you know, just a solid preschool program that's, you know, for the most part, 5 hours a day. And then within that, what specialized instruction and special education supports kids are going to get. So we in fact, at a PPT, it's kind of nice to say to families, the classification you choose does not drive where your child goes or what your child does. Your child drives those decisions. So we have a lot of those conversations. So we do have the opportunity and the folks to support kids if they do need some level of direct teaching, or our ABA can do that within the classroom setting or pulled out. You know, it really is very individualized. You know, the biggest struggle that we're finding right now, and what I'm interested, you know, to hear from other districts too, is that ratio. We had for years had a ratio of 5 kids with special education needs to 10 general education students in every class across 13 classes right now. Just last year, we moved to 6 kids with special education needs and 9 general education students, and we're really struggling to hold on to that. And it is a budget issue. It's an expensive program to run. We understand that. But we're really looking at it compromising all the learners, not just our kids with ASD or other kids with special education needs, but also our gen ed students, you know, and the implications that it has for them because of, you know, gen ed students come as needy sometimes as some of our kids, you know, with special education needs. I think all of us in early childhood recognize that. So.
Yeah, I know.
So
I
the
remember
ratios
the
are
lottery
up.
system. It's hard. It's hard. Yeah, especially when you have either a lottery system or something else going on, and you want those kids that are borderline to come into.
Right,
Then
right.
it, yeah. Anyone else?
And it's
Oh, go
all
ahead.
relative too. The special education needs are all relative. Not all kids have comprehensive needs. So 50-50 ratios, which I know is kind of like the what's acceptable.
Minimum.
It could look very different from one class to the next, 50-50, really depending on the makeup of the students. So
Exactly. True peer models versus someone else. Thank you, Beth.
So we talked a bit about basing the decisions on the individual needs of the student. There's no hard and fast rule for, you know, if you have this diagnosis, this happens, but there's some general guidelines. For example, we have a half-day program and a full-day program, and it's not like a student with autism gets automatically put into the full-day program. It's more of a question of, can we meet the child's goals and objectives properly in the half-day program, and if not, then we consider the full-day program if that's appropriate. Similarly, when we have the question comes up about para support, we're currently piloting an adult support manual to try to delineate that decision-making process a little bit more. We have a rubric that gives a score. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's just sort of general guidelines as to whether a student needs one-to-one support, partial support, or shared support, or no additional adult support. But then there's also other questions as part of that process, you know, making sure that the students' accommodations are being implemented with fidelity, making sure that there are things in place like a visual schedule, and things of that nature.
I like that you mentioned the goals and objectives, because I do a lot of IEP audits and reviews, and often I find that the number of goals and objectives don't correspond to the number of hours and the amount of specially designed instruction that's required. So Amy, you're from Windsor. That's why I know your name.
Yeah, we've spoken before.
Yes, we have. Okay. Anyone else before we move on? We'd love to hear from you what your issues are. It helps us to plan things that we could focus on with your, with your assistance.
So one of the things, I was in group 2, and one of the things that came up was, it seems like a lot of the districts, the programs have a heavy emphasis on DTI base, ABA principles, and within certain fields themselves in special education, speech pathology, there seems to be a move away from some of that. So just trying to determine, on an individual basis, what's best for the student, but also in terms of the research base, what's most effective, and then also taking into consideration parental preferences, because parents have different responses, different suggestions also.
Right, and that the results are, a little poll there earlier certainly showed that DTI and ABA came up as, two of the biggest programming that's out there right now. And I completely agree with what you said, Mary. We got to look at the whole scope. It might not be the perfect intervention for a particular child. Someone else? We'll do one more.
Because like I said, the time it's forgetful in daily activities. Like, not really. He doesn't fidget.
That's people still coming in and going out. Can I move the slides, Anne Marie?
So parents didn't say anything, they just sent that in and asked to fill it out. Yeah.
No, I can't. She didn't give me control.
Okay, not for this part.
I don't have control. All right, so we're going to refer back to our guidelines that were originally created in 2005. And somewhere along the lines, I had this revision from 2011, but right now it still says 2005 document we have. So I can remember being a very young coordinator back in 2006, and this was my Bible. It had been out for a year, and I was running an early childhood program in a district where the parents were almost as knowledgeable as I am about what autism was. So I really had to dive deep into what we were doing to make sure that we were putting together an effective program for my very astute parents who obviously wanted the best, as they should have, for their child. So if you actually want to take a look, if you have this or you want to look at it later, all of these are on page 42 of the document. I was actually going to download some of them, but then I decided not to waste the paper. I'm sorry, 48. So it's on and around page 48. So it takes each of these and explains it in a little bit more depth. All right, so one of the biggest characteristics is obviously we want to get them at the earliest intervention time possible. The earlier we get them, the better our chances are of planning for them, of molding their brains in the direction that they need to be molded. So basically we want to get those interventions as soon as they're determined eligible to get those better results.
And it's the same people. Oh my God, does it have to be the same people?
If anybody's forgotten to thank you. I think people start talking and then all of a sudden they realize, oh, I wasn't muted. The next characteristic in the guidebook, oh, go back, Anne-Marie, you went too fast for me, is the family involvement in cooperative planning. So does the program that you're currently using, and will the one that you are going to be using, if that's what you're here for today, does it include family involvement in cooperative planning with the family? Family is a huge part of it. Is it individualized and intensive? Really intensive enough to make sure it's meeting the needs of the child? Is the curriculum that you have comprehensive enough? And we're actually going to dive deeper into that a couple of slides from now. And again, it's all there in black and white, all of this in the guidelines. Do we have systematic instruction and ongoing objective assessments? So if you are using the dots in a very good way, or doing some form of assessment, hoping it's the dots, then you are doing systematic instruction. We're taking a look at things as they're occurring and making the changes right there. Is the environment structured? And is it predictable? One of the first things we think about always is our environment. The environment is always the first place I go if a child is having concerns, because it's usually the changing the environment is typically the easiest thing to do. Are the staff and the personnel that are in this program trained? Have they been specifically trained for what they have to do? Are they a real good fit? And their peer relationships are emphasized. Okay, Anne-Marie, now I'm all set. All right, so you guys are going to know that you're going to be getting this today hot off the press, right? It's still in draft form, correct? It'll always be in draft form. No, we're always changing things and trying to make them better, so it's not necessarily a bad thing. So the guide that we'll be sharing with you today is going to help you to choose a model or improve your model or add to your models. You certainly don't have to pick one. There might be certain programs that are suitable for different students. And these are the things that you're going to look at, and we want you to reflect on as you're thinking about what model you want to choose. Are there sufficient number of hours, and is the intensity of the services there? Is it small group? Is it intensive? Is it one-to-one? Is the environment comprehensive, and do they have access to typically developing peers? And what does that access look like in particular? Is there an ambitious curricular content across all of the domains of the L's? These, we often find our students on the spectrum have skills in very splintered areas at times. So that's a very important thing to think about. Ambitious curricular content. Again, systematic instruction and database decision-making. If we're using our formative assessment, the dots as we should, we would have that in place. And then a functional approach to problem behavior. So are we actually looking at problem behavior as an unmet need as opposed to the child being bad? So anytime we look at a behavior, we look at it from a functional approach. Is it something that they want to get, or is it something that they want to avoid? The two functions of behavior. And then there's all types of other sub categories within those. And then last but not least, the guide will help you with thinking about reflecting on the family involvement and support that you have. Okay. So again, just remembering to go back to the guideline if you want to have this reiterated or read about it a little bit further. So when we are considering developing or selecting a very comprehensive curriculum, which is what you're going to be thinking about, this is what you want to look for. A developmental sequence to teach those skills. All right, so that helps to improve their acquisition. Is it step by step by step by step? And it's developmental. Are we incorporating areas of strength to compensate for those areas that they may have a challenging time with? Are we making selections that are based on assessments and what the family likes? And are we teaching specific functional skills that come from a task analysis of current and future least restrictive environment demands? So what are the functional skills? In some ways, those access skills that they need. Like, for example, sustained attention, right? Do we have those things? Are we teaching them? They can't learn without sustained attention. So that would be a very specific functional skill. Okay, Emery. Some other considerations. Using a structured approach to determine the commutative function of problem behaviors and teach those alternative socially desirable commutative responses. This is all part of the pyramid model as well. The way that they're describing this, that structured approach. And then directly address core deficits. Attention, spontaneous, communicative intent, and abstract reasoning. And then the other thing, and this is true of everything that we'll be sharing with you, all the different models today, you want to make sure that the approach that you're using is backed by a lot of research, evidence-based research. And you want to base that content and the sequence on individual progress. And then making sure that the adjustments are made according to the ongoing assessment. Does Anne-Marie, does anybody else or in the group want to share anything or add to that I may not have added or included? Before we go on to the piece about the engagement. Okay, you can move on. All right, so when we talk about intensity, I mentioned whether it was one-to-one, but the true test of intensity is the engagement level of the student. And one of the things I have found when working with students on the autism spectrum is that it's sometimes very difficult to see what their level of engagement is. They may not be making eye contact with you, but they may be very perfectly engaged. So we need to really be very more conscientious of this with this population. Most children with AST spend little of their own time engaged in purposeful, appropriate, goal-directed behavior. All right, so there's an end, an if, and then an end. There's gonna if and then, very goal-directed. But they tend to be disconnected from their surroundings, or they're fixated on their objects, the specific aspects that they may be, the things that help them calm down and soothe themselves. So when we're talking about engagement here, we're thinking about it as a measure of intensity, and it's referring to the amount of time a child is attending to and actively interacting with others. So that would take some very direct observations to see how often that's actually going on, so that we can actually increase the engagement. And actually, any questions on that before we move on? Either in the chat or you can just unmute yourself. When you're looking at the different programs and analyzing them, so you want to see how well they do this. Okay, you can go back again, Anne-Marie. Go forward again. The other thing from the guidelines when choosing programs or making a consideration for a program is what type of specifically trained personnel are you going to need? When we're putting together an ABA program, which I've done in 2 different districts, one of the things we had to make sure was that we had our RBTs and we had people trained to do discrete trial instruction. And that was a lot of training and ongoing training throughout the year as well. So we have to think about that. As you're looking at the different models that are out there, and think about how much training is going to be required, what the capacity is going to be, but we want them to be trained very specifically on working with students with ASD. We want them to know the importance of early intervention, especially when their brains are developing. We want to make sure that there's cooperative planning and family involvement. Again, individualized and intensive programming, comprehensive curriculum. So this is basically all the things that we take as considerations for our own programs that we're choosing. We want to make sure that we are training the personnel, because our program is only as good as the staff that are in it. You can have an awesome program, and if you don't have great staff, it may not work. And I know that that's one of the biggest problems that we're finding in our profession this year, is finding really good trained staff members. And then the other thing is transition planning, which wasn't specifically mentioned with the considerations, but certainly how do they transition the students from program to program, from event to event, from activity to activity. So transition in every way you can possibly think of it. All right.
All right, before we go into the models, we are going to do one more breakout group. And then we'll talk for a minute after that, and then we'll actually take a little break. For this breakout group, we initially wanted to ask the question as we segue into our models, how satisfied are you with the current services you're providing? But then, you know, in our discussions, we started to talk about how do we really measure how satisfied we are? What does that mean? So we decided to ask the question of you, what data you collect about the effectiveness of your current program, and what does that data tell you? And then we want you to reflect on that. And, you know, I mean, in your conversations with your colleagues, this might be a time to explore what, you know, what data should we be collecting, or what are some other measures we might consider in the evaluation of our programs. And then the last question is, what are the main goals that you want to achieve by evaluating your services for children with ASD in your district? So, you know, I think this conversation can be both, what data are we collecting? What data could we be collecting to really tell us what our, you know, how effective our programming is, and also maybe open up the conversation about what changes we might need to make. So we're going to break you into your groups, and Anne-Marie, I think you're in control of that. And yeah, and then hopefully people will share out a little when we come back. And I will put in the chat the questions. All right, now that everybody's back, I hope that you had interesting conversations around data. I'd love to hear from people if, you know, if anything interesting came up in their group, what kinds of data, they're taking beyond maybe, student specific objective data or behavior data, or are there other things?
Out real quick, just because we talked about it at the very end of our group. So we talked, I'm sure, to what other groups talk to, but one of the things that we do is we try and get parent feedback information. So one of the ways that we do that is at each of our conferences. So there's set times of year, we offer surveys to our families. So now they're virtually, so they're sent virtually, but it's nice when they're in person because it's something for them to do when they're waiting. And it's just kind of a quick one pager relating everything to how do you feel that you're communicating with your child's team/teacher? Do you feel that you're getting the resources that are in the community? So everything from our free and reduced lunch to community events. So do you feel that your child's making progress? How do you feel your child is learning? So just kind of those types of topics. So it's just a nice way to, it's speaking to the effectiveness. We might see our program being more effective in a different light than a family might be. So that was just one thing that we talked about.
I love that. I think that's really, really valuable. The skills that we teach kids at school are only as valuable as, if they're generalizing and happening in other contexts. So I think that's really, really great. And I also think it's brave. It's brave to ask families, how do you feel about the program? Sometimes you probably unearth things that you weren't expecting, but it's all, I'm sure very good for improving programs.
And we actually ask them to send the results to the principal because our hope is the hope is they would be very honest, and they might not want to be as honest to their child's provider because they don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. So we do, all the results go to our administration.
Wow, good for you guys. It's good. Anybody else? Yeah, so, beyond just the data that we take on student, objectives and goals and behavior, there are other measures like the parent, surveys, staff surveys to determine how your staff feel about the training they're receiving, how they're feeling about, the work that they're doing can be something worth looking at. Mary Jo talked about engagement. This may or may not be an actual student objective, but taking measures of student engagement, taking measures of, peer behavior compared to the students with ASD and how do they compare. There's so many different things that you can look at. And it's definitely worth, exploring, especially if you're trying to make decisions about your programming. Also, maybe I'm jumping ahead a little, but the tools that we review, some of them have program checklists. So those checklists help you look at the effect, and beyond the programs we're reviewing, these exist where you can get, autism program checklists to sort of self-evaluate the programs that you're offering. So these are all things that can help, drive what you're doing. Okay.
Carrie, we have a, sorry, go ahead, Stacy.
So I just had a question on the checklist. We were actually talking about this in our small group. Is that within the document or is that in addition?
So, if I spoke specifically, again, jumping ahead a little bit, the program that I reviewed has within it a tool for measuring your own program. So when the document that we're providing you will outline what is available and what is part of each of these programs. And if you were, interested in, really exploring one of them, then it's within those, specifically in the case of Project Data, it's in the manual that they offer. So if you were to purchase the manual, you would have all of the tools that come with that particular model.
Oh, fantastic. That was actually my specific question. Thank you.
Yep. Okay, I suppose we can move on. So now the moment you've all been waiting for, the comprehensive intervention programs for young children with autism spectrum disorders. When we set to do this project, this kind of all started as Anne Marie said over a year ago, Dr. Andrea Brindle from the State Department of Education reached out to Anne Marie and asked her to spearhead this project. She saw the need, and she explained to us, what her thoughts were and concerns and what she really wanted to see created. And so Anne Marie put together the team of us, folks from different RESCs that serve young children with autism across the state. And the purpose was to put together a sort of guide that outlines different models beyond, as everybody mentioned during the word, forgot the word for it, Anne Marie, the Mentimeter. DTI was in the center, right, of that model, which wasn't surprising, because it seems like when we think of young children with autism and we think about how we're going to program for them, our minds go straight to DTI. We are not telling you that you shouldn't use DTI. We're telling you that there are a number of programs that are more comprehensive that may include some DTI, but that they are more robust and take into consider more things. So we chose 6 models to review and outline, and we chose them based on the research that had been done to demonstrate effectiveness. So all of these models are evidence-based, and also how widely they are used. So the 6 models that we're going to talk about today are the developmental therapy, developmental teaching, the DTT model, the Early Start Denver model for young children with autism, the LEAP preschool program, the project data model, CERTS, and the TEACH model. And one other thing that was pretty cool, that throughout this process, we had Eileen Schwartz kind of consulting with us and just monitoring what we're doing and contributing to this work. And she is an expert researcher, professor, and happens to be the developer of Project Data Model out at the University of Washington. So she helped us along the way make this a thorough and rich document. So when you review the guide that we put together for you, again, it's important to note that once you have this guide, once you read through it, that does not mean that you can now implement the Early Denver model. This will help you make decisions about what model might be most appropriate or most attractive to you and your team. And then it's up to you to go further with that model. To get the materials, to look at training, to look at what it takes to implement it in your district. But what the guide will tell you is information about each of these models. So it'll give you the model philosophy, what is taught within that model, who can teach it, where it's taught specifically, and what methods are used to teach, assessment information, the role of typically developing children, implementation steps, approach to challenging behaviors, logistics regarding training and research. So it's sort of at a glance, what do these models offer, and how do we implement them? We're going to take a break here in just a second, but before we do, when we come back from our break, we're going to start reviewing these models. So if there's any questions or comments before we end, please speak now.
Can I just double check with Liz and make sure you didn't have another question? I just want to, your hand is raised and.
Oh, I'm all set. Thank you.
That's okay. Okay.
I'll put my hand down.
No worries. Just wanted to make sure we didn't miss them.
Okay. Can I ask a question quickly?
Please.
Yes, I was just wondering, are all these 6 models predominantly based on the preschool population, or could they be geared towards elementary and maybe middle and high school population as well?
You know, they're not all geared solely for young children. I know, for example, and if everybody who researched a model wants to chime in on theirs, the model that I reviewed, the data model, is specifically for preschool age students. Could you utilize it for kids a little bit older than that? Yes. High school would probably not be appropriate. On the flip side, I know we're also reviewing Teach, which does span the ages, where you could use the Teach model with older students, from my understanding. I don't know if Amy and Stacy and Ann want to speak to the models they reviewed.
I can jump in. Oh, sorry, Amy, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I can speak to the ESDM and say that it too is primarily just geared towards preschool age. However, like Carrie said, the underlying teaching principles could certainly be carried out with older students as well, but it is a preschool curriculum and model.
The 2 models that I'll be talking about, developmental therapy, developmental teaching, which is called DTT, and then the CERTS model, are both lifespan models. So where very applicable with early childhood, also ranging to support the person with autism throughout their whole educational career and into adulthood.
LEAP preschool program has it in the name. So it is exclusively a preschool model, and the research around its effectiveness is centered on preschool age children. So, and Mary Jo, well, actually Carrie already touched on Teach. So,
okay, do we want to take a break? And how much time, Anne Marie, would you like to give the group?
Now, is 10 minutes okay? I see some head nods. Yeah. So 10 minutes. So 1:45 according to my clock, but 10 minutes. Feel free to mute yourself, shut down your camera, step away from the computer, and we'll see you back here in about 10 minutes.
Hi, my name is Stacy Kronk, and I will be reviewing the developmental therapy, developmental teaching model. And it's also called DTT, just to shorten it up because it's a bit of a mouthful. But I am going to start by going over the model's philosophy. Developmental therapy, developmental teaching. Let's go back.
We can't see your slides.
Anne-Marie, perhaps you can help me control.
I was able to see the slides. Anne-Marie, maybe you should take control and just move the slides.
Great, I will do that. Can everyone see the slide on the screen? Is there anyone who cannot? I guess I should. Okay. Well, so go ahead, Stacy.
Okay, thank you so much. We'll start over.
Advance the slides.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Anne-Marie. It's teamwork makes the dream work. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stacy Kronk, and yes, I'm going to be reviewing the developmental therapy, developmental teaching model, and I'm going to start by talking about its philosophy. So developmental therapy, developmental teaching, also known as DTT, is an educational approach used primarily with children who have social, emotional, or behavioral challenges. It was developed by Dr. Mary Margaret Wood, and developmental therapy includes comprehensive assessment of student behavior, communication, social, and cognitive development, individualized interventions to facilitate healthy personality growth across all of the developmental frameworks, and ongoing monitoring of student development. DTT begins with the assumption, and this is crucial, that all children progress toward maturation along the same developmental pathways, and that the acquisition of the milestones along this sequential pathway is important for healthy social, emotional, and behavioral development. In short, every human that is born, it doesn't matter who you are, your skill level, your culture, your location, we all go through the same initial 5 stages of development. And then there is a sequential trajectory of the milestones that we go through as we go through those 5 stages. DTT also is important because it emphasizes teaching those universal competencies that mark healthy maturation for all students pre-K through 12, and it's also used for school-wide continuum of services from prevention to targeted to intensive supports. Developmental therapy teaching offers educational approaches for educators and places developmentally matched objectives and instructional strategies at the center of the intervention process. Okay, Anne-Marie. What is taught? Several measurement instruments provide an evaluation component for this approach. I know this was asked a little bit earlier. So there's the social emotional behavior quick profile, the SEB quick profile, and that's an initial screening procedure with indicators of a student's current stage of development. And then there's also the developmental teaching objectives rating form revised, the DTOR, which is used for an in-depth assessment of a student's social, emotional, and behavioral development. The results become the foundation for the instructional planning and the IEP objectives that are selected to make sure the student is working on those needed missing competencies. This knowledge, in turn, of course, facilitates selection of instructional activities and materials that are developmentally and emotionally appropriate for every and each student. Decoding behavior provides additional information as well for selection of positive growth-producing behavior strategies. And achievement of these competencies replaces old maladaptive behaviors to assist students of any age in doing, saying, relating, and thinking in constructive ways. Okay. The fundamentals of developmental therapy, developmental teaching. There are 4 main beliefs. Belief number 1 is focus on strengths. It's a strength-based view of behavior that will foster self-esteem and encourages behaviors that are healthy and typical. Experiences with peers that bring satisfaction and success strengthen a young person's identity as one who can succeed, and so promote identification with all that is considered normal, rather than encouraging identification as bad or other. Belief number 2 is that it follows developmental guidelines. The normal process of social, emotional, and behavioral development in every human follows a predictable and orderly fashion. So belief 2, however, does recognize that biological makeup and previous experiences with people can contribute to the uniqueness of each child's journey along this developmental path. A program like this can be truly effective in promoting growth by being sensitive to the individuality of each child within the pattern of typical development. Belief number 3 is provide pleasure and success. Constructive changes will occur when acceptable behavior and relationships bring personally satisfying results. A young person's willingness to try new behaviors results because they had pleasurable, successful past experiences. So this program must provide a way for young people to have these kinds of experiences in order for them to be motivated to learn. And the 4th main belief of developmental therapy, developmental teaching, is making all experiences relevant. We recognize that student learning results from events that have emotional and cultural meaning. It then spreads to all areas of a young person's life. So if you're using DTT in your school and in your program, it's so crucial that it relates to the young person's world outside of just the school setting. The skills learned in the program must produce satisfying results in personal real-life situations. Okay. Who can teach it? Teachers, related service providers, paraprofessionals can all add developmental therapy, developmental teaching to their classroom strategies for students with social, emotional, and behavioral disabilities. DTT helps you help children. The task of a teaching team is to work together and ensure that the entire group is motivated to participate and that each member feels recognized, enjoys participating, and is successful. It's important to maintain the involvement of all students, the teacher, the related service providers, the paraprofessionals, who all have very specific responsibilities as team members. And specifically, DTT uses a lead support concept. And in that, classroom staff facilitate engagement and participation of all students based on the developmental needs of the homogeneous group. For example, the lead conducts the lessons, runs groups activities, makes decisions, and maintains the rules. And then all the other staff that are in the room at that time are supports, and they're there to give students the individual assistance they need and to help them remain focused on the lead so that the group can have meaning and cohesion as they learn. Okay. Where is it taught? When planning a school-wide student support system to meet the educational needs of students with varying degrees of learning challenges and problem behavior, there are usually those 3 levels of intervention: preventative, targeted, and intensive programming. So such program diversity can definitely be provided school-wide with developmental therapy, developmental teaching as the framework. Because of its focus on teaching key competencies needed by all students, DTT has broad applications in general education programs focused on prevention. For example, a typical school environment that provides support and sensitive management for typically developing students can prevent problems from developing. So that's your prevention part. Students with specific needs may require targeted interventions to address the missing competencies that are found on the detour. And so for these students, teachers can blend developmentally based interventions into existing programs, such as developmentally based individualized education plans, IEPs, which can be portable and not dependent on any particular academic curriculum or organizational structure. The developmentally based IEPs can be embedded in a fully inclusive setting where developmental practices are added to an existing general education curriculum, a modified cluster plan for partial inclusion, so maybe pull-out or resource room, or reverse inclusion, which typically developing peers or a social program plan in which a special group has scheduled opportunities with typically developing peers. Okay. How it's taught. DTT integrates 4 major developmental domains: behavior, which is that doing that I alluded to earlier, communication, which is saying, socialization, which is relating, and cognition, academics, which is thinking, within the universal 5 stages of human development from birth to about age 16. So for example, DTT defines stage 1 as birth to approximately 2 years old in typical human development. Stage 2 would be 2 to 4 and so forth. Each stage develops sequentially while building on the other domains. Key milestone competencies are numbered as the DTORF, items for assessment, IEP planning, instruction, and accountability. These items are universal because they reflect broad qualities all people acquire as they mature in any culture. Okay. The role of typically developing children in DTT is developmentally based individualized education programs. So IEPs are portable and it's not dependent on any particular academic curriculum or organizational structure. So using DTT can be in various settings and yes, hopefully includes typical developing children. Each program can be carried out in whatever setting is most effective for that student's learning. Sometimes the programs are in a fully inclusive setting where developmental practices are added to an existing general education curriculum. Sometimes intervention may be provided in a modified cluster plan for partial inclusion, or sometimes, as mentioned before, reverse inclusion with typically developing peers can offer great benefits of inclusion. Okay. So developmental therapy, developmental teaching is operated through the Developmental Therapy Institute, DTI, in Athens, Georgia. DTT programs have well-developed field-tested resource materials and certified instructors with extensive experience in planning and implementing this direct service model with preschool, school age, or teenage students. When working with local programs which have committed to replicating components of this model, the costs are negotiated. I know that's probably going to be a big question we all walk away with or ask, you know, how much does it cost? So the costs are negotiated at the time that the initial training agreement is finalized. And if you're wondering, within the state of Connecticut, Cooperative Educational Services, CES, that RES, the Preschool Primary Learning Center is a demonstration site for DTT. My school and my program have successfully been utilizing DTT for about 40 years and seeing it make huge avenues for growth and continued development for severely impacted, developmentally delayed, challenged, and autistic students. Now, I don't know if anybody has any specific questions about this at this time.
If you have a question, if you use the raise your hand feature, because we have so many participants, that helps us be able to see you, or put it in the chat.
Otherwise, I'm certainly willing to answer any questions later or at any other point. And so I think I will now turn it over to Amy to review the Early Start Denver model.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Stacy. Yes, I will do a brief highlight of the Early Start Denver model for young children with autism, and I'll refer to that as the ESDM throughout. So the ESDM is a comprehensive early intervention model. It was built on the foundations of the original Denver model that was created by Sally Rogers in the 1980s. Which was focusing on preschool age children ages 24 to 60 months. The authors later identified a need for deeper thinking around some of the concepts affecting young children with autism, such as the role of imitation in early years. And then they later developed the Early Start Denver model as an extension to the Denver model, and now includes children as young as 12 months of age. So like all successful early intervention models, the ESDM is built on a firm understanding of early childhood development, but may be set apart from other models by its explicit behavioral teaching paradigm, which is strongly data-driven and explicitly covers all developmental domains in its teaching practices. Some of the developmental domains, ranging from receptive and expressive communication, fine and gross motor skills, adaptive behavior, and sensory social routines. In addition, there is a heavy emphasis on play skills in the natural environment in this model, particularly establishing joint attention routines. Okay. So when we look at overall what is taught in this model, you can see that the broad developmental goals or the types of skills that the child is taught through the ESDM closely resemble that of any typical preschool classroom. So following daily routines, engaging in purposeful play and appropriate use of objects, or interacting spontaneously with peers. These are probably very common goals for all young children in preschool programs. So while they're not unique, what is unique is the way that they are taught within the ESDM model. It's focusing on acquiring these specific skills, but embedded inside the play routines at a high rate. And then with careful application of such principles like reinforcement and prompting, or fading and shaping and chaining. So those are kind of what make up the core components of what makes the ESDM unique. Okay. So as I mentioned, all developmental domains are targeted in the ESDM curriculum, and it happens across 4 skill levels, ranging in developmental ages like 9 to 12 months, all the way up to 48 to 60 month range. So for example, level 1 would focus on the skills developmentally appropriate for about 9 to 12 months, level 2 thereafter up through skill level 4. The teaching practices within ESDM come from 3 main intervention traditions, rooted in applied behavior analysis, pivotal response training, and then the original Denver model. And when combined, the techniques are designed to engage the child in positive emotional experiences with another person that draw that child's attention to specific social stimuli, make that stimuli rewarding for the child, and to foster the child's motivation to create a high likelihood for them to engage in those activities again. So ultimately kind of forming the foundation for meaningful connection with others. Those joint attention routines are of particular focus and provide the platform for teaching in the ESDM. Okay. So when we look at who can teach it, the ESDM curriculum and delivery draw directly from developmental and child psychology, early childhood education, speech pathology, occupational therapy, and ABA. So any individual who is using the ESDM needs background in the knowledge-based concepts and practices from these disciplines. This is most easily gained from a team of early interventionists who can cross-train each other in their concepts and practices underlying the ESDM. However, therapists and paraprofessionals may certainly carry out and implement objectives under the direction or guidance of a professional team member. However, the team and what is recommended by the ESDM model is that it should include at least one certified ESDM therapist who is on site to oversee and lead specific activities, such as developing the child's treatment objectives and steps from the ESDM curriculum, to monitor the data and progress regularly, to train and supervise staff members in the ESDM practice, to regularly observe staff members delivering the intervention, to use fidelity checks to assure fidelity of implementation, to adapt each child's intervention plan as needed, to assure best practice, and also to kind of hold those regular treatment progress meetings and make sure that the plans are up to date, and to keep all team members informed. Obviously, parent involvement is also a key part of the ESDM program. You want to make sure you include the parent in not only the development of the child's plan, but you're going to want to train them and ensure that they can carry over many of the skills and concepts when the child is at home or out in the community with them, so that it encompasses their entire day. Okay. So the ESDM's naturalistic teaching procedures allow it to be used in a variety of teaching environments. So in center-based preschools, inclusive preschools, parent-delivered interventions, or home-based interventions. Parents and therapists can both use play-based therapy wherever they are to work towards the development of positive relationships and associated relational skills. So again, everywhere the child is. Okay. So when we think about how is it taught, well, there's a 400-page manual that'll help with that. But, you know, to kind of just give a brief overview. So the ESDM takes a structured and practical approach to building a daily teaching plan for the child's learning objectives. The curriculum takes you through a process of how to develop short-term learning objectives balanced across all the learning domains by completing what they call their curriculum checklist. And then through that process, you utilize developmental task analysis and create learning steps for each objective. And these are the steps that are used to construct their data sheets and planning guides. The therapist uses that data sheet and planning guide to guide the learning that day. Always at the forefront of teaching is the use of rich learning activities taught in 2 phases. The first is becoming a play partner. So this involves first establishing your presence as helpful and reinforcing, and then taking a more active role in play. The second phase is developing the play into elaborated joint activity routines, both with and without objects. And finally, the ESDM curriculum also provides guidance about how best to support students while considering the characteristics of autism, and addresses 3 basic learning needs: reducing competing sensory stimuli, supporting communication through both verbal and auditory input, and supporting temporal sequencing or classroom structure. So those are some components that the ESDM wants to make sure people consider when they're thinking about how to best teach and implement for each child with who may be affected by autism, as those are often areas of deficit. Okay. And then when we look at the role of typically developing children, obviously typical peers play an important role for all young children. For children who do not initially show interest in peers, skills may first be targeted in individual teaching within the classroom activity and in short one-to-one teaching activities during the day. This may include parallel play activities that draw the children together within the same physical space with 2 sets of objects for each child. You might have the children facing, in a face-to-face positioning or across the table from each other. This allows the adult working with that target student to still attend to all of their needs, but while being in the presence of a peer, to start to give over some of that reinforcing power to some of those peers. Then small groups are utilized to generalize skills through peer interactive play sessions. And the target student begins engaging with the peer with fewer adult prompts and supports needed. And then finally, for children who have learned to carry out a number of joint activities, like you can set up play dates within the classroom where the adult is able to kind of scaffold the interactions by prompting, but you want to limit how much of that prompting you're providing to allow that ongoing interaction between the children. Okay. And finally, there's just a few resources here on this last slide that might answer some questions about the use of the Early Start Denver model as you go back to talk with your teams and try to decide what model might be best for your program. There's a few resources here. So I think at this point, I turn it over to Anne Marie, who's going to talk about the LEAP model.
You are, and we will. I just want to pause similarly to last time. Does anyone have any questions about ESDM before we move on to LEAP? Okay. So the LEAP preschool model, as we did mention previously, is a model that is exclusively focused on preschool age children. I think that some of the other elements, related to its philosophy are that it is very, very intentionally implemented in inclusive early childhood classrooms. In order to make it work, well, part of why that is so critical is because it also has a heavy emphasis on peer-mediated interventions. And so obviously without the ability to access peers or to have peers within their learning environments, there would not be the ability to utilize that intervention model or that intervention strategy. So again, really also focused on social goals, addressing those goals in a very targeted and specific way. There is a family component to it as well. Families are involved in the planning, but they also are provided with supports and strategies for how to implement those strategies at home with their children and as well as out in the community. There is a very specific form of data collection also related to and the implementation of goals and objectives that is specific to LEAP. And then previously somebody asked about checklists for implementation. LEAP also has its own fidelity checklist as well. So what is taught, as I said, really heavy emphasis on social skills. Sort of communication is embedded within the implementation of reaching those social skills. There are 5 primary social skills within the curriculum that children are working toward. They emphasize gaining attention of peers, sharing, using giving toys or giving materials as the basis for developing sharing skills, requesting toys from peers, requesting materials from peers, increasing play organizing, and increasing social connectedness by giving compliments. There also is ultimately within each of those interactions, they are working toward a 4-cycle sort of serve and return. So initiate, respond, initiate, respond, initiate, respond. And the data that supports the implementation of LEAP, its effectiveness, is that when children are able to get to that 4 cycles of interaction, it becomes an achieved skill and reaches that level of independence that we're really working toward when we're applying interventions across the board. Who can teach it? Essentially, all of the people who we typically think of supporting the growth and development of young children with disabilities, as long as they have received training in the LEAP model. There aren't any specific qualifications or any people who are eliminated from the possibility of being able to use the LEAP curriculum and implement the LEAP curriculum. As I mentioned before, so where is it taught? It is exclusively embedded into inclusive preschool classrooms. If you were to engage in a conversation with trainers from the Pele Center, which is the center that you would access in terms of scheduling, finding training, scheduling training, they would say that they're looking for classrooms that have a 3-to-1 ratio. So 3 children without autism to 1 child with autism. So that's something you should definitely take into account given our 50-50 ratio in Connecticut. Again, something very specific to LEAP that we have to think about when you're thinking about exploring those models. Again, how is it taught? Primarily the strategies are, again, connected to peer-mediated interventions, errorless learning, the use of time delay, incidental teaching, pivotal response training, and picture exchange communication systems. So as you're going through LEAP training, you are learning, if you don't already have that background, you are learning those strategies in addition to the prescribed way that each of those 5 skills that we mentioned before are taught. And essentially, again, you go through the same process for each of those skills, describing the skill, demonstrating right way, wrong way, practicing with an adult, practicing with a child, and then the reinforcement system is interwoven throughout each of those steps. But there's a very specific assessment that LEAP uses to analyze each child's possible reinforcers, and then that is again applied in the teaching sequence. Okay, so before we leap into project data, I'll pause here. Questions about LEAP? Jennifer, you have a hand raised.
Hi. I just had a question because a lot of the children in our preschool are coming in with suspected autism, but they haven't been formally assessed and qualified for autism. Some are still under the developmental delay. So would this still apply, or do they need the diagnosis or meet the criteria prior to partaking in the LEAP model?
I would say from a LEAP perspective, no, you would not need the diagnosis. If you have, again, as with all of the other models, LEAP is intended to address the primary areas of impact, autism that autism impacts. And so if you have a child who is demonstrating those similar, deficits, issues within those areas, then I think that LEAP would certainly be able to apply. Again, the research around its effectiveness was done on children who have the diagnosis, but again, I think it would be effective.
Thank you. And then my second question, the 3-to-1 ratio, is there a maximum amount of students that would be in the room?
That is a good question. And off the top of my head, I don't have an answer to that.
Just curious.
Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right. So Carrie, we are ready for you.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about project data model. The philosophy of the project data model is an inclusive school-based approach to educating preschool students with autism. Its goal is to provide programming that is effective, acceptable, and sustainable. The project model core beliefs are children with ASD are children first, and student failure is instructional failure. This model was developed by Eileen Schwartz at the University of Washington with her colleagues, and they strongly believe, and I really like this point that and it's the inclusion piece that is the crux of this program. So that's the critical element. And, they believe that inclusion, and I believe this too, is not just being in the room with typical peers. Inclusion is being a member of a community, a member of a group of friends and peers. And so that's really sort of the crux of project data model, is helping that student become a member of the community. The outcomes that they're looking for with the project data model overall are membership, relationships, and skills, and they all kind of tie together. Go ahead. So in project data model, what is taught? School readiness skills such as attention to teachers and materials, following directions, social skills, and independent use of school materials are a focus of project data model. Independence in the school and community environment is the ultimate goal and is achieved through evidence-based practices applied in the context of the preschool environment. These evidence-based practices are, for the most part, based on applied behavior analysis. The project data manual provides a skills checklist and instructional programs in the areas of adaptive, executive functioning, cognitive, communication, social, and play. So this manual comes sort of with a curriculum, and each of the programs within that curriculum have descriptions of how to implement them, data systems to use, and the skills checklist helps you identify what skills you should be focusing on. But they do say that you should use it in concert with other skill-based assessments that your district may use. So who can teach project data model? The head teacher should have a special education certificate, training in ABA, and experience working with young children with ASD. Ideally, the head teacher would also be a board certified behavior analyst. The head teacher is responsible for training and supervising all of the teaching assistants. The classroom assistant should have a college degree and experience working with young children with disabilities, and all staff should receive training on the project data model. Training is available online. I will share a link to the website to kind of get a sense of how you might get this training and what the cost might be. So where's it taught? Children spend about half of the 20 to 25 hours of the program, which is what is recommended in a high quality integrated preschool program. And the other half of time they receive intensive instruction that may be one-on-one or small group depending on their needs. An activity matrix is used to identify what learning objectives will be addressed in each scheduled activity. And so what that looks like is a schedule of the student's day and the different domains and what skills will be addressed across each area. And this kind of speaks to the earlier question of intensive instruction and integration. If you have those IEP objectives that you are focusing on embedded in all aspects of a student's day and are deliberately programming for those objectives, then you are implementing an intensive program, even in the context of the natural environment. And we do that through embedded learning opportunities, which are episodes of embedded instruction that occur within ongoing classroom activities and routines. So the instructional practices used in project data are based on the principles of ABA. Skills are taught through discrete trial instruction and naturalistic teaching strategies, shaping and chaining. So teams implementing project data should not only be proficient in these methods, they must be skilled at determining which method of instruction is best matched for the skill that's being taught. And, of course, the role of the typical developing children is extremely important in project data model. It's an integrated early childhood experience is the center of this model, with specialized instruction and support combined with developmentally appropriate practices. Preschool students with ASD have frequent and regularly scheduled opportunities to interact successfully with typically developing peers. As we all know, this is not easy for students, typically not easy for students with ASD. So it is in this context that we must teach them how to have these interactions. So this is where the work takes place. So there are project data model books and online training available to guide the teams through implementation. I put the link to the website there. One last piece that I did not include here. I mean, when you have the, there's a lot deeper explanation of the model in the guidebook, but one thing that probably should be added is that in the project data model, family involvement is essential. It's a key element. It involves, it involves home visits, parents coming to the school to do observations, regularly occurring parent trainings alone with the family and also in groups of parents. So this is also a key element of the project data model. Any questions? I think mine was the quickest one so far. But now I guess I will hand it over to Stacy because she is going to review certs.
And I'm not sure that we mentioned before that we will send out a draft of the guide after the meeting. So you guys will have access. We'll also send the PDF of the PowerPoint, so you'll have the links, but the links are also in the guide as well. So.
Hi again. I am fortunate because now I will be reviewing the CERTS model for all of you. The philosophy of the CERTS model is that it is an evidence-based framework that addresses those core domains of social communication, that's your SC, emotional regulation, that's your ER, and transactional supports, which is your TS, by ensuring that the environment is adapted with both interpersonal and learning supports. This is an innovative educational model, and it's based on the integration of research and clinical practice published by Dr. Prezant, Amy Weatherby, Emily Rubin, Amy Laurent, and Patrick Rydell. CERTS as a framework allows individuals, families, and practitioners to select the most essential areas of focus based upon research in child development, longitudinal outcomes in autism, and related neurodevelopmental conditions. I am very fortunate to know Dr. Prezant, and we'll allude a little bit more to that at the end, and have been a participant in the journey and the evolution of the CERTS model. And it's just been a wonderful opportunity to see it in play. So going on to what is taught, the CERTS model is comprehensive intervention model for children with ASD of all ages. So going back to that question, is it just for preschool students? No, it is for preschool students, but it's also for beyond, and in fact, all the way up to adulthood. And all ability levels, anyone who is on the spectrum is and can be supported by the CERTS model. The CERTS model provides very specific guidelines for helping an individual become a competent, confident, and social communicator, as well as an active learner. The guidelines are provided to help an individual be most available for learning, to be engaged, and I know we talked about that earlier, right? The importance of engagement, and to prevent problem behaviors. So the fundamentals of the CERTS model, I just touched on that a minute ago. The acronym CERTS stands for SC, that's social communication. That is the development of spontaneous functional communication, emotional expression, and secure and trusting relationships with children and adults. Social communication is key in the CERTS model, and certainly for all individuals, and including those with ASD who may struggle to communicate successfully. The ER, emotional regulation, this is really significant. It is the development of the ability to maintain a well-regulated emotional state so that students can cope with everyday stress and to be most available for learning and interacting. The idea of emotional regulation is that we, for example, with all of us, we all have an arousal level. And at that point, that's where we're calm. Our arousal level is calm. But you know, sometimes we might become over-aroused or under-aroused. So we might become very nervous and we might become very low in affect. And so the idea of emotional regulation is recognizing where that student with ASD is, where is their typical level of regulation, and then understanding how to support them so they can be as emotionally regulated, because only when you're regulated can you be available for learning. And then the TS, the transactional support, that's all of us, and that is really crucial to understanding the model. The TS is all of the developmental and the implementation of supports to help partners respond to the person's needs and interests. It's the transactional support who's going to modify the environment and provide the various tools to enhance student learning. Specific plans are developed to provide educational and emotional support to families and to foster that teamwork among professionals. So that's really, we'll be talking about who can teach it. We'll understand just in the name of the model, the TS, that transactional support is really about all the people who are involved in ensuring the model is successfully implemented for that student. Okay. Yes, so who can teach it? So a unique aspect of CERTS is that the most significant challenges are addressed while identifying and building upon strengths. So the CERTS model provides family members and educational teams with a plan for implementing a comprehensive and evidence-based program, which is going to be able to improve the quality of life for children with ASD. CERTS is very family driven. There is the SAP, the CERTS assessment profile, and there are in fact, 2 different versions, the version that the educational team, those transactional supports would complete, as well as a whole nother part for the families, because the family's role is so important to successfully implement the CERTS model. It is implemented as a multidisciplinary team approach that respects, draws from, and infuses expertise from a variety of disciplines. So whether it be the general educator, the special education teacher, the speech language pathologists, the occupational therapists, child psychologists, all the people in the team are very crucial, and really it is driven that the families have an equal participation in it, because obviously they are the ones who know the child best, who can support them overall beyond just the school day. So it's a huge team of people who need to work together. But I will say, as we were mentioning manuals, the CERTS manuals are user-friendly and accessible for professionals, paraprofessionals, and parents. There is volume 1 and volume 2, but they are very easy to read. So where is it taught? So as I mentioned, it's a lifespan model. So it can be used from initial diagnosis throughout school years and beyond. And it can be adapted to the individual's unique needs, their settings. It can be for younger children, preschool. It can be for older children and then adults, because it can cover home, school, community, and even vocational settings. In the CERTS model, educational and environmental supports are developed and implemented so that children can be more actively engaged by supporting their social communication, that emotional regulation, and therefore their learning. For example, it's well accepted that most children with ASD are more effective at processing and retrieving visual information than auditory information. So it's essential to specifically identify the types of various supports that a student might need based on their developmental capacities. And then you utilize that, and the transactional supports are derived that are going to help that student grow. Another essential transactional support is curriculum modification. So as often as it is necessary to support a preschool child success, it's important to recognize that each plan will be individualized to where that student is, to make sure you are supporting and increasing their social communication, their emotional regulation, and provide them with all of the supports they need to be an engaged, available learner. How it is taught. So the CERTS curriculum is developmentally sequenced, and it provides a systematic framework that ensures specific skills and appropriate supports. which are your educational objectives, are selected and applied in a consistent manner across different settings. And that's important to make sure that there is the generalization and acquisition of these skills. So whether it's home, school, or out in the community. This process allows families and educational teams to draw from a wide range of evidence-based practices with a specific focus on promoting initiated communication and emotional regulation in every day, every single activity. The CERTS model is most concerned with helping persons to achieve authentic progress, which is defined as the ability to learn and spontaneously apply functional and relevant skills in a variety of settings with a variety of partners. Role of typically developing children. It is greatly encouraged and extremely beneficial to have the typical peers as involved in a student's life, whether they have ASD, severe communication challenges, or other developmental challenges. It is recognized that those typical peers can provide very motivating and exciting opportunities for the student with special needs. Interactions with children without special needs and children who could provide good social and language models and more natural activities and routines are viewed as an essential part. This is due to the flexibility and opportunities for problem solving and negotiating inherent in these natural activities and experiences. And these opportunities with typical developing peers can help children who don't have ASD also grow, because they're going to become more sensitive and supportive partners, and they themselves also will develop a greater understanding of children who have developmental differences and just become themselves a transactional support to their peers who may have challenges. So the CERTS model recognizes that that relationship between ASD students and typical students is really an opportunity for both sets to grow and learn and benefit from each other. For a current list of trainings, please refer to the link, but the CERTS collaborators recognize the need for ongoing educational and training activities designed to support educators and clinicians and family members. Therefore, ongoing efforts are underway to provide educational activities that will foster greater success with implementing the model. So you can check out these various sites to learn more. I also was remiss and did not mention there's also Uniquely Human, which Dr. Prezant wrote. Now it's been 6 years ago, and he's actually doing a new edition of it. But that's also in kind of a quick, easy read to just get a glimpse into the lives of various people, children who have ASD and how they face this world. And it does directly connect with their needs for social communication, emotional regulation, and transactional supports. I should also say that once again, the Preschool Primary Learning Center at CES is another demonstration site for the CERTS model. And so if anyone is interested in seeing the CERTS model and developmental therapy, developmental teaching in action with students with ASD, that is happening at CES. So that's always something you could reach out to me if you'd like to learn more. But otherwise, I'm going to turn it over now to Mary Jo, and she's going to review the TEACH model.
We learned a lot of models and a lot of information. And last but certainly not least is TEACH. And I'm going to be blissfully short for all of you, because basically the TEACH encompasses everything that everybody has already talked about. some areas in a more structured way and some areas in a less structured way. You'll also probably notice that teach, it's the only one that's appeared on our slides where I have not added what the acronym means, and that is intentional. Although I will say it, I did not want it in print. And when I tell you what it stands for, you'll know why. It stands for the treatment and education of autistic and communication handicapped children. So I know most of you probably react to that word handicapped in very similar way that I do. So I chose just to put the word teach, and in case anybody asked me the question of what it stood for, I wanted to make sure I had that information on hand. So just a little bit here about the philosophy. It's an evidence-based program, and it's based on the idea that students with autism are visual learners. So teachers must encourage and correspondingly adapt their teaching style and intervention strategies. And as most of you know, a lot of the other programs that we went through here also have visual strategies as an emphasis. So it's based on 5 basic principles, and those focus on the physical structure. So that's an environment, having a consistent schedule, establishing very specific expectations to create independence. Routine is essential, and everything needs to have visually based clues. So those are those 5 principles. Okay, Marie. So the core values, one of the things I do love about the teach program are the values, and those core values that underlie what is behind the whole philosophy. So really it's so that we begin to understand more and appreciate people with ASD. And there is a very, very big commitment to excellence and a strong work ethic. It also has a pragmatic can-do attitude. Failure is not an option. Everybody can do it. There's a big spirit of cooperation and collaboration among everybody working with the individual. And its focus really is to look for the best in ourselves and the others around us. Go ahead. So what is taught? And I can see I combined this all on one slide, which is a really good thing, but it's 10 of 3 and everybody's probably getting tired, right? Take a nice deep breath, we're almost there. So what is taught? Situations that have meaning and predictability. Sorry, that would be Otis. Skills for adult life. Otis is my dog, sorry. Spontaneous communication. All right, so instead of just learning communication in an isolated situation, spontaneous with some back and forth. And very, very, very big important focus on independence. And where do you find the programming? Well, it's in schools, homes, job sites, recreational activities, therapy session, camps, and stores. And who can be trained? Parents, teachers, and therapists. The training with this is not very extensive, but there is some very good training associated with it. Okay.
Any questions about Teach?
There is the website on the next slide, Anne-Marie. Oh, you took that slide out. Yeah.
It had the video, but again, you'll get the guide. I know, as Mary Jo just said, it is the end of the day, but I hope you can hang on for just a little bit longer because we did just review a lot of information. And we recognized that if all we produced was the guide and turned it over to people, that you might read through it or get halfway through it and then put it aside because it is a lot of information. And making this decision is in and of itself needs a process to support it. So we also developed the reflection tool, and I'm going to show you the reflection tool in a second. I'm going to switch and change screens, but the reflection tool has 5 pieces to it, right? The first one is establishing the team. The next one is your reflection on how services are currently being provided for students in your district, and a really thorough reflection of that, and also collecting that information across your team. And then you start to establish your priorities. Why do you need to do this? Why do you want to do this? So that as you start to review the models, then you can really make those good decisions based on what we currently do, what we know about our program, where is it working, where is it not, and again, what are our priorities? So I did email it out to everyone, so you do have a copy. If you haven't checked your email recently, it's in there, but this is what it looks like. And so again, that's just the overview about, overview about the steps, right? But it gives you the opportunity to really think about who is currently on your team and taking the time to establish your team. Using this question, thinking about if you're going to do this, who really needs to be on this team to support decision-making, training, and implementation. So the whole process, because it's not just about choosing the model, then we have to get to the point where we're learning about the model, we're learning how to implement it, and then we're actually implementing it. Again, pausing and taking some time to really establish a team. There's a place in the reflection tool for you to be able to document that team once you've had that conversation and you've established that team. Part 2 is that reflection on your current service provision, right? So there's some guiding questions there to help you to describe your current services. And there's a place again to record what your services currently look like. Further exploration of your services, there's a chart in there that can help you start to really analyze, again, what services are being offered. Are you satisfied with them, or is this an area for growth? When you think about quality, is that an area you're satisfied with, or is that an area of growth? Do your services meet your requirements of FAPE? Again, some of those things that we talked about before. And then it moves into implementation. What are your data sources? And what does that data tell you? And then ultimately, the next step is determining priorities. So once you've collected that information, so once you have your team, once you've collected your information and reflected on your services, what are your priorities? Are you looking for improved child outcomes? Are you looking for increasing parent satisfaction? Are you looking to improve instructional practice? And then there's a place for you to come up with some other priorities or outcomes that we may not have thought about. The fourth part is where you really dive into the model overview. So not until you've done those other pieces are you really going to start to target thinking about what model would are models we want to explore. So this chart, again, just gives you a place to record your thoughts. You fill in model 1, model 2, model 3. You don't have to review 3 models. You could review 1, you could review 2. That's really up to you. And then there are some guiding questions to help support the review of the model. Okay, part 4, sorry, I will get there, whoops. Part 5 is where we start to develop a team or start to develop a plan. And there are, in addition, some guiding questions there as well. So that is the reflection tool. We strongly suggest that you use the reflection tool, that you, again, that you utilize that tool to help you guide implementation. This is not like this is not just making a decision about we need a new form to collect data. This is really intense process that you're engaged in, and trying to, again, to make that determination. So I pulled up the PowerPoint again. There are follow-up sessions that will come along with this work. What we're hoping that you will commit to is that between this session and the follow-up session, and those dates have not been set yet, is that you, people who are participating today, if you need to, you will go back to your district and you will expand, broaden your team. And then you will together as a team work on parts 2 and part 3 of the reflection tool. When we come back together for the follow-up session, we will dive a little bit deeper into the models. You'll have a chance to learn more about the models, and then you'll be able to complete that part 4. You'll be able to do that with your team to complete part 4 in terms of gathering your information to help you make a decision to narrow it down to the one model that you're interested in implementing. And we'll come back together for our 3rd session to flesh out your implementation plan using those questions from part 5 in the reflection tool. Yes, Stacey.
There was a question about whether or not the PowerPoint would be emailed to each participant.
Yes. Okay. So you will get all of the information about the follow-up session. As I said, you have the reflection tool, you'll get a draft copy of the guide. But again, we're hoping that between this session and our follow-up session, which won't happen until January at the earliest, that your teams will be established and that you'll move through parts 2 and, well, part 1 is establishing your team, part 2 and part 3 in the reflection tool. Questions, you're welcome. Questions, comments, or thoughts before we sign off on Friday afternoon? Feel free to reach out to any of us. We're happy to take questions, and if not, have a wonderful weekend. It's Friday. Thank you for your time.